This episode of The Construction Record is brought to you by the Greater Toronto Sewer and Water Main Contractors Association. Clean water, our goal, our future.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 105 of the Construction Record podcast. This is Vince Versace, National Managing Editor of the Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce, joining you today for this special podcast, our first crosspod of the year, first crosspod of 2021. So joining me is a fellow podcaster in the construction sphere. I'll let him introduce himself and tell you a bit more about his podcast. Go ahead, Rahul.
Oh. Thank you so much, Vince. My name is Rahul Faria. I launched a podcast earlier last year. It's called Build Our Future Podcast. Essentially, it focuses on tech, sustainability, operations, essentially just talking to people and companies that are changing mindsets, changing thought, engaging in thought on how we need to change. I'm sure we've all, as part of the construction industry, I'm guilty of it as well, kind of get stuck in our ways sometimes a little bit because we think we know exactly how it's done because we learned it 20 years ago. But then there are other people out there that are just like, you know what, something clicks in them and they start pushing with something different. And my goal is to try and cut through the noise of, Google searches and this and that. And, really kind of, I'm a contractor by day job, as I say. So, for me, it's a lot of time researching and, I just wanted to talk to people, to put it out there. So, we're all such busy people and people can just listen to it when they want to, see if it, resonates with them, see if a thought, an idea, a concept kind of resonates with them. It's a nice little snapshot, 30 to 40 minutes kind of thing that we just talk concepts on, where we were, where we are, and where we're going within that concept. And, I've met and talked to so many interesting people and, just kind of some stuff I didn't even know was possible. And people have actually years doing it. So it's been pretty fascinating just to kind of going through something like that.
That's pretty awesome. And for your listeners, the Build Our Future podcast, as far as the construction record, so we're a podcast that's powered by Canada's two leading construction publications, the Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce. Chances are, if you're in ICI in particular, in Canada, whether it's in the West or here in Ontario, nationally, you've heard of one of our two publications. So we launched
and used it as well.
Yeah, there you go.
Substantial completion forms and so on and so forth.
So you're very familiar with us. See?
Oh, yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
You do enough of those, you get an episode on the Construction Record podcast. That's the bonus. But for everyone else, for your listeners that may not be familiar with us, we launched a podcast to start telling more of the story behind the story and give a bit more context to the stories our journalists and writers were covering. And so we just wanted to carry the conversation in a different way, in a different method, a bit more storytelling, a bit more just general discussion like you and I are having when I have it with my staff. And we talk about any issues, whether they're domestic, affecting Canadian construction, whether it's provincial, we'll mine down even more locally if we have to. But we've had international guests, and just like you, looking for the game changers, the trendsetters, people that may be seeing something coming. And because we've had guests, just like as you have, international guests, that pick up on the value of the podcast and having the conversation with you. So for our listeners and for your listeners, I hope you get something out of this. Basically, Rahul and I were talking, and we thought, why don't we talk about the year ahead? Yeah. In construction, the way we see it through the two lenses that we have through our respective podcasts and our respective work. So, my friend, I will throw the question to you first.
Oh, yeah.
What in particular are you looking at?
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
You know what? Everyone knows we're in a bit of uncharted waters, right? Since it's affected us here in Canada since mid-March last year. And, initially everyone had, let's say, everything stopped. We know construction stopped completely, right? And kind of give a reset on, okay, how do we manage construction sites? How do we manage these things going forward? And it's interesting because even to this day, a lot of people still ask me, like, how come you're not as busy? Like, construction's open. And it's not as simple as saying construction is open, right? There's a changing landscape right now where, costs are increasing. Not like, forget like your regular, upcharges and costs with suppliers and materials and, logistics and lead times, because the schedules are changing as well, right?
Mm.
Like there's nothing you can actually, you can create a schedule and a Gantt chart so nicely, right?
Right.
But, with manufacturing, facilities across Canada and the US, working at half capacity, a third capacity, everything down the chain has an impact, right? And it's not just those, because they're also waiting for materials. So it's, I think right now as contractors, we have to be, extra patient with our clients. I know that runs thin sometimes,
Right.
because, the independent clients and, the people that are not exposed to construction as us, as much, they always need a little bit more coaching to understand. It's not everything that you see on HGTV, as simple as
Right.
that.
Yes.
So, by and large you do, but now especially, you have to be a little bit more patient with them and really explain to them before you sign on the dotted line. Because what I find is, once you sign on the dotted line and then you say, but,
Change order.
you always run into issues, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, from my perspective, I've been fairly lucky. I mean, by fairly lucky, I'm saying, we were shut down for 6 months last year, but, now some of the clients are kind of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel with the vaccines potentially coming out. So, they're starting to look at, restarting construction. We're starting up a few projects next week. And I've heard quite a few other people as well are doing that as well. They're jumping on to, get kind of be ready for like the spring and summer, because, going through the winter is going to be challenging. It's Canada, it's, as they say, the long dark winter, but people are actually looking forward to the spring and summer, because they do actually see a light that's a lot closer, right?
Right.
At the end of the tunnel. The large projects are always going to go on, the condos, the municipal projects. It's the stuff that comes in with the private funding, the private entities, the developments kind of thing. Those are the ones that you have to keep an eye out on, because costs are increasing. Health and safety considerations, the number of people you can work in a space, hand sanitizers, all of that. It's an extra layer of health and safety that we have to be aware of. And I know a lot of companies are doing it differently. I don't believe there's any specific right way in this time, but there's definitely a few wrong ways.
Yes. Well, that's for sure. And those are clearly evident most of the time, right?
Exactly. How do you see it? How do you see it coming up over the next few months in this year?
Yeah. Well, picking up on your thread there around private versus public projects. And I was having a discussion for a couple podcasts ago, our first podcast of 2021, with Alex Carrick, our chief economist on staff. And he looks at everything construction in North America. And I posed to him the question, my thought process was, well, because of the restrictions and the changes that COVID is creating, not just in how we're working right now, but how about what we're building or what needs to be in place when everybody starts to come back to work. So my question was more along the lines, I was wondering with 2021, the maintenance and renovation side of construction. You know what I mean? Is it safe to say there's going to be a pickup in that area, right? Because people need to remodel their offices maybe to make them palatable and comfortable for their employees to come back. Because we look at the offices that we were in before and it's kind of funny, right? There once was a time we were all in little cubicles, sectioned off from everybody.
Which would work really well right now.
Yeah, which would be really great right now. But then there was this whole change, right?
Yep.
Open concept, thinking spaces, collaborative spaces. And well, now what happens, right? How do you start to put in back those kind of safe spaces, the physical distancing in these offices? And well, what's the knock-on effect of that? And I'm curious to see that in 2021. It's still maybe a little too early to see, like, I would imagine a big wave of renovation and remodeling, because people are still trying to figure out how to survive. Yeah. Look at it right now, as you and I talk today, Ontario had record number of COVID cases. We're worried about the capacity of our healthcare system. But I look at that and I wonder about you contractors like yourself too, right? It's, how do you keep working in this environment, right?
Going on your thread with the offices, I had an interesting conversation on one of the episodes. Gentleman named Danny Sang, he's with an interior design firm called Syllable. And we talked about, a hybrid office, essentially. Like, is that the future, right? Because I think what people are finding, especially in office spaces, is that they've had to adapt and learn to trust more if that makes any sense. We're so used to managers and everybody else, and even teams being in the same office to collaborate all the time. And this environment has kind of forced us to use Zoom, use Signal, use Slack, use all these other collaboration softwares out there in order to get to an end result. But I don't think that an office is ever going to go out, to be perfectly honest with you. I think for it, especially in a collaborative space. You know what I mean? So my sense is, and I know from talking to a couple clients, they were looking at reducing their footprint of their office and kind of doing like a half off-site, half in the office, but creating more collaborative spaces, as opposed to an open desks, open office where everyone comes in and comes out kind of thing, right?
Right.
I had to kind of change my thinking a little bit too, because we had an office as well for quite a while, and this is before COVID too, so it's kind of funny how it worked. And like December 2019, I was just like, at any given point in time, I have less than half of my office in my office, because they're on job sites, materials, all these things. So I'm like, do I need this footprint for, maybe a tenth of the year? Like, does it actually make sense financially to commit these costs on a monthly basis for this, just to have somebody's desk there, as it were? Right? You look at some of the larger corporations and financial institutions, they actually have, there's no dedicated desk. So when they come into an office, they just plug in and then they go.
These hoteling stations, as we call them.
But their space is their space, right? So I think in terms of an office, I think that's where it's going to go. I'm really curious to see what's going to happen with retail, to be honest. Restaurants, I'm not too, even though we do a lot of restaurants, I'm not so concerned about it, because one of I was talking to my wife the other day, and we were talking about highlights of the year, right? And one of them was we went down to a pub in Milton with a couple of our friends who were in our bubble, and they had like the plexi screens and stuff, and we were so excited because it felt normal. You know what I mean? So, that kind of environment, I think there's always going to be a need for. It just depends on when people are going to be comfortable, right? And different people get comfortable at different stages, different rates. But the retail is something the brick and mortar retail is something I wonder about.
I do wonder too, because you see a lot of the curbside shopping, like there isn't really a construction knock-on effect with that, or knock-off effect. You know what I mean? We're doing more curbside. It's more logistical for the retailers, but those big spaces, like already it was a story we had started covering a couple of years ago, kind of the death of the shopping mall. Right? Yeah. Especially in the US, you have like these gargantuan spaces that are empty now because of people because they'll tell you it's because of Amazon and the Walmarts, crushing all these smaller retails that would be in malls. So, it was interesting. I was coming across a story. I can't remember the company now. There's a company that's looking to pick up an old mall in the States and turn it into their headquarters, and it'll be what happens to these other retailers. I don't know. You were in the GTA, you and I, and around Christmas. I remember driving by Bass Pro Mills. You know what I mean?
Jammed.
It was jammed.
It was jammed.
You know what I mean? There were lineups outside. It was one day. It was like freezing rain and sleet, and people were lined up. You know what I mean?
But I wonder if that's also cause and effect, right? The lockdowns were going down right after Christmas, so everyone's jumping in to get in there, right? So, again, it's one of those, no one knows the actual answer. Kind of just make the best decisions in front of us. But, construction is timeless. It's one of those things that I know a lot of people talk about it in my circles. It's one of the most underappreciated industries out there, right? But also one that's always needed. Right? So it's one of those things that I think we're always going to survive. I think it's just a matter of, look at the residential sector during COVID. It's gone bananas. Totally. It's like because people aren't traveling, people aren't committing costs to, other stuff. So and they find that now that they're within their house a lot more, because they're not away for 40 hours during the work week, they're like, you know what, this really doesn't work. Let me find out what it's going to, what I need to update this or fix it or change it or tweak it to my daily needs. But when you're stuck in the grind and you're just going, you come home, it's like, it's not a big deal. It's not a big deal. right? I'm not here all the time, just the weekends and the evenings. So
yeah, I'm
I don't
guilty of it
necessarily
too.
do it.
Yeah, not being in the contracting business, but being
Yeah.
somebody that's handy in construction and likes my projects. Always had the weekend projects. We'll schedule them out. Literally, like kind of taking the work mentality. Okay, for the first quarter, this is what I'm going to do. You know, when spring comes up, I'll redo the
That's
porch.
right.
I'll redo this.
That's
You
right.
know, but
That's
now
right.
having been home based since March 14th, 2020,
Mm-hmm.
it's like there have been projects I've tackled I never would have got to because I've been sitting here in the space, right? And my
Right.
wife's working in the space too. It's like, okay, what does work for us and with the kids?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that project, might as well just start picking away at it since I'm here, right? And
Yeah.
now, mind you, when we're dealing with these larger projects, it's interesting with the industry, you know, and I wonder about contractors like yourself having to adjust. You mentioned the COVID safety parameters, right? Maybe give our collective listeners a bit of that
Sure.
journey that you went through to learn what the best practices were, what you should institute. I think that would be interesting for people to hear.
Yeah. So when it first happened, like I was, we shut down right away. You know what I mean? We shut down, I think actually almost a week before, because some of my clients were getting a little antsy as well. And we're like, you know what, let's just take a step back, right? But then through the process, I have a third party health and safety company as well. So talk to them a lot. And, initially part of the challenges were that there was no clear direction for construction on what met needs, right? I think in other industries too, right? It was almost like, well, if somebody had an issue, call MOL and they'll come and inspect. Well, that really doesn't help when you're trying to, push on projects and stuff like that. But, for us, what we did was we ended up, we have sign-in sheets every day for contact tracing. While I don't ask for individuals' phone numbers, we do. I mean, obviously we got contracts with their office, so they have their phone numbers, I hope. Anyway, but so we do a temperature check as well, just to make sure, get them to sign off daily about, have you left the country, have you where have you been, did you get exposed to anybody, how are you feeling, just those things. I mean that's all you can really do, to be perfectly honest with you.
Right.
I try not to have more than, depending on the size of the job, so if it's a smaller, like 1,500 square foot space, depending on what's scheduled, I won't have more than 3 contractors in that space, like 3 companies.
Yeah.
But again, it all depends on where they are working. If they're working in different sections, not a big deal.
Right.
For me as well, I always, talk to the trades and find out, okay, have they been working with the same person, or are they working with multiple crews, right? I'm pretty lucky in that sense as a small business, that a lot of the trades I deal with, they're of the smaller variety, not large. So they don't have massive crews. They've got 2 to 8 people that, that are always on the job site. So they generally there's 2 people that 90% of the time always work together. So it makes it pretty simple. So they're always around each other. It's almost like that's their little
mini bubble.
Their mini bubble of construction, right? So it makes it a little bit easier. Site meetings, everyone wears masks with the clients, masks. We try and social distance as much as we can, depending on closer to the end, it's harder because it's a little tighter. But I think it just depends. I have hand sanitizers on every job site as well. A lot of them have disappeared, but well, not so much now, but initially they did.
Yes.
But not so much now. People understand. Not everyone likes it, unfortunately. But my concern isn't really right now. Right now I think people are just, for lack of a better term, putting their head down and pushing through. And saying, you know what, they have to do this when they go to a restaurant. They have to do this if they wanted to, for people who've got daycare, my kid, when we take him to daycare, he's got to get his temperature checked as well. You know what I mean? So, we just putting our head down and saying, this is what we need to do. What I'm really questioning and concerned about down the line is when the vaccines come out and they're more accessible to the general public, or they are accessible to the general public. What do we do as business owners? What do we do as people in general? Like, do we mandate? Do we not mandate? If we don't mandate, what risks are there? Does the government have a right to mandate? I mean, that's a big political question. But I mean, these are all legitimate questions, because these are all legitimate conversations that I'm having in my personal life too, with family and friends. And it's no different in business. I mean, especially construction with health and safety, you have no idea what's going to happen. Like, is that going to be mandated? Is not. And, will that affect performance on jobs? Will trades, because of their staff, who are not comfortable, like, let's just say we have to do a mandate, like, how is that going to come play? Now, if I mandate it for my team within One Oak, in the construction company, do I have a right to do that for subcontract? There's so many questions. Right. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, it's one of those, and I don't envy the decision makers that have to make these decisions in the coming months. It's going to be, I don't know. Have you had any conversations to that effect, kind of thing?
Yeah, our reporters start to ask some of those questions about when a vaccine really becomes prevalent. And I did too in a couple of podcasts near the back end of last year, looking ahead. And well, you said you don't envy the decision makers. The one universal thing I got from everybody that I spoke to is we all agree whatever they come up with is not going to be good enough to somebody. like the lesson we've learned with the mask. You know what I mean? Like, just putting a piece of cloth on your face for the 5 minutes you go into a store to get a gallon of milk, right?
Yeah.
Wow. You know what I mean? And and that's, and look at the pushback on that. So imagine a project owner. You got to wonder, will it happen on public projects, right? When you look at liability, that's some of the stuff that we're starting to explore. Like, will a public owner go, well, look, anybody that's on our site needs to be mandated to have had a vaccine? Like, it's a lot of speculation. I mean, and right now, when we look at it, we still got to wrestle this second wave, right? Collectively, whether it's our industry or in our personal lives.
Yeah.
So I wonder if it's questions, that are percolating, but until we kind of get through this next rush, do we?
But I agree with you in some respects, but to be honest, as a business owner, our whole premise is based on forecasting and planning with cash flows and this and that, right? So like, literally it's, and obviously liability protection and everything else, so it's really challenging, but at this time we really have to, wait and see, you know what I mean? It's one of those where it's kind of interesting. My wife keeps telling me that I'm pretty surprised during this pandemic, you're not as stressed as you usually are when there is work. And there's because I was shut down for about 6 months with work, right? 6.5 months, 7 months. And I was like, yeah, you know why? She's like, what? I was like, for the first time in my business life, I could not have made one decision differently to affect this outcome.
Right? It was totally taken away from you.
There's nothing I could have done. Everything else, you can beat yourself up. And I think this is one of them, right? All you can do is keep reading and keep talking to people such as yourself and other people within our circles. And honestly, and just trying to make the best decision moving forward. Not even for me, I know a lot of people don't like, when I ask them to sign in every day. They don't like it that I ask them for temperature checks. They don't like the talks every morning, but we have to, you know what I mean? It's just, the other stuff too. I mean, all the other toolbox talks that we've had to do over the years, that's become standard. People got used to.
That's right. Yep.
Right. But when anything is new, there's always the question, because, it does feel at times that the information is just not just in your face, it's jammed in your face sometimes, right? So it's hard as humans not to be like, why is it just jammed all the time? Like, why aren't they talking about different things? You know what I mean? Like, different perspectives, right? It's only natural to question that, right?
Yeah. And it's interesting too. You mentioned a little while ago, to work off of that, the business of construction continues, right? Yeah. Things are getting built. Things need to get built. You and I have talked about this. From the moment we wake up in the morning, our eyes open up, we swing those feet off the bed, construction's touched your life, a couple of different ways, even before you get ready. And so like with our team and what we were looking at as we reviewed 2020, besides COVID is a big impact, right? But in construction, like looking ahead, some of the other themes we still want to explore, because they percolated last year, a dynamic year beyond the pandemic. When you look at stuff like with racism in construction, right? A topic we were covering pretty heavily, and we're going to dive into even more in 2021. Like, what are the outcomes of that? That shook this industry. While it's dealing with a pandemic, right? Yeah. And all these restrictions, you start getting that uncomfortable conversations now finally being had openly a bit more, right? And different jurisdictions in Canada are dealing with different types of discrimination and racism on sites. There's always kind of the prevalent people in the West, Western Canada will tell you, well, Indigenous workers have always been dealing with it. You know what I mean, on construction sites. Whereas here, what's prompted the conversation in Ontario, as you know, as one of, like, in listening to our podcasts and our readers know, it's the actual overt racist acts that were happening at some of these construction sites. Whether it was I'll use the term, some jackass, just doing it for kicks, you know what I mean, putting up these nooses, or if it was serious, right? It raised a very uncomfortable conversation during very unprecedented times. And the conversation doesn't end just because the calendar year changes to 2021.
Yeah, you know, when that happened, I was actually pretty floored, pretty shocked. I mean, quite obviously, you can look at me, I'm visible minority, as they say. Although sometimes in Toronto, you would say I'm not, but that's a different conversation. You know, I guess I've been fairly lucky over the years, you know. I've not necessarily had or experienced that overt racism within the industry. You know what I mean?
Right.
I have been treated very differently. But that's also because I was really young at times, and you know, as a quality control technician, you know, with you know, testing compaction on a job site. I'm going back to like the early 2000s now. You know, trying to tell somebody who's had 30 years in the experience, you know, that I think that happens across the board. I'm not saying I've not had the subliminal stuff, you know, you know, but I mean that stuff. You know, we all go through it at times. We all have our stereotypes that have been built in for a long time, and it takes a long time to break those. But I mean, that actually shook me a bit too, because I was pretty surprised at, as you said, the in-your-face racism that was there. You know, and I don't even know where to start with that, to be honest with you. I mean, quite obviously, it's never accepted. Like, forget a construction site in life; it's never accepted. You know, for me, my questions are always, you know, it's interesting. I took, and this will be a little bit, maybe a bit controversial, but when I was in university, I studied civil engineering at Waterloo, and we were mandated to take some courses, you know, that kind of built your worldview. So you had to take different courses, kind of thing, and one of them was called the study of evil, right? And basically, and I thought it was an interesting concept, but it was pretty interesting. And they talked about, you know, racism. This is, you know, and they were talking about, you know, when somebody has a racist perspective, it's wrong. You have to talk to them and try to change them. But what you have to try to figure out too is, where did those ideas come from? Where did that thought come from? Was it their was it, you know, what is it, their family? Is it friends? Who is it? And that's an uncomfortable conversation to have, right? Because most of these thoughts are not formed from one experience. They're formed from, you know, different people telling different people different things. I mean, you know, we're all guilty of you know, passing jokes and think it doesn't sting sometimes. So you know, that's one of those uncomfortable conversations. But, you know, I think depending on the space, I do feel like it's not as prevalent as we think. I think if you ask me personally, most of the prejudice I think that's out there has got nothing to do with race, in my personal opinion, and professional, I guess you could say. It's more to do with people who don't know what they're doing, acting like they know what they're doing.
Yeah, which is dangerous you know in construction, period.
Which is dangerous in construction, right? Like, you know, it's that's where I think there's a lot more angst, a lot more bile and vile that comes out. And sometimes it manifests them in different ways, which is pretty terrible, that it comes to that. But, you know, that's an interesting, like I was pretty shocked at that. I was pretty shocked at that, you know. But, you know, I did a couple speeches at Lambton College to some of the, you know, international students that were looking to, you know, learn more about construction project management, and just talk to them about how to get into the industry. And, you know, they had some of those concerns as well, if you can believe it, you know, because they have accents. And, you know, you always, you know, when I first immigrated here in the 90s, I also had that concern. Will I be treated differently because of my accent?
Right.
You know, and the answer is yes and no. I think at the end of the day, most times when people actually get to know you as a person, I think that's when things change. I know that's when it changed for me.
Sure.
Once people knew that if I didn't know, I would say I don't know. Can you let me know?
Mhm.
Even to this day, I don't profess to know everything, so I always try and ask questions if I don't know. And I think people appreciate that more.
Hmm. I know. For me, it was well, I'm Italian, of Italian descent, so I don't consider myself whatever white,
Mhm.
right? You know what I mean? I have an a
Sure.
heritage of some kind, but
Hmm.
um, I remember my dad's construction crews. You know what I mean? Our listeners know I reference my father a lot because he was in residential construction, and I have these memories of my dad kind of feasting. He'd have some of his guys from his crew eating in our basement or in our backyard in downtown Toronto, and grew up in an immigrant neighborhood where we didn't have any white friends. We didn't have any Canadian friends. We had Portuguese, we had Chinese, we had Indian. Primarily
Yeah.
friends. That's what they were, or Spanish.
Hmm.
And I remember those crews, and there was never a white guy. Right, there were Aboriginals, First Nations, Indigenous
Yeah.
folks. He had Black Jamaican guys on his
Hmm.
crew, Portuguese guys on his crew. Interesting thing is, the one thing they didn't have in common was the English language. You know what I mean? But you know what I mean? They could all communicate on the construction sites, build these homes in Milton and in
Yeah.
Peterborough and
Yeah.
in Oakville, but then talk the language of workers around the
Yeah.
table after a hard day of work at construction, right?
Hmm.
So I was caught a little bit, and to see that kind of overtness, those overt acts like that, that's what made me think: is this somebody just playing along, backing off on the, trying to play off the BLM stuff, which is totally
Hmm.
legitimate
Yeah.
in not just in the States but here in Canada. You know what I mean? Were people
Yeah.
trying to have fun off of that because it's not funny? But I was
Yeah.
surprised because I was raised in a construction environment and family where there was nobody, there were no Caucasian people.
Yeah.
It was all
Yeah.
immigrants coming together to work hard to make a living. And I know it sounds like a very idealistic story, but that's the reality for myself and guys of my generation
Yeah.
that grew up in construction families. So I was so disappointed to see that
Mhm.
and to see it continue. That was the thing with Toronto. And it's like, well, is it a joke or is this real? But you know what was real was the discussions and the
Yes,
fact
for
that
sure.
this needs to happen. We need to
Yeah.
have this talk because it is there,
Yeah.
because there are some people that are expressing that frustration, right? So curious to see how
And,
that plays out this year, right? Go
that
ahead,
it was
sorry.
taken and that it was taken seriously, whether it was a joke or not.
Yep,
That's the important
exactly.
thing as well, right?
Hmm.
Because sometimes things can be said or done in jest, but
Right.
obviously that's an extreme example, but I find
Mm.
that, even if it's just a comment that's made in jest, or, you know, I much appreciate when somebody tells me, "Hey, that was a little off base,"
Yep.
because we've all had our own experiences too,
Hmm. Yep.
right? And a positive and negative, and different comments affect different people different
Right.
ways,
That's
right?
right.
Um, so
Mm.
yeah, you know what? That's for me. That's yeah, but honestly, the one thing I will say though is um, I don't think it's as prevalent
Hmm.
in our industry. To be perfectly honest, I think it's more based on what you're saying.
Hmm.
Your experience with your dad and the people around him that built these homes everywhere. I do think for the most part that's what it is.
Hmm.
And I do feel that it's just like every other thing, right? Like you got your bad contractors, you got your good contractors, you got your bad lawyers, you got your good
Mm.
lawyers. You know what I
Right.
mean? And I'm really grateful that the conversations were real and they were serious, because you know 95%, if not more, of the contractors are just trying to make an honest living.
Hmm.
You
Yeah.
know what I mean? They're just trying to build it, make some
Hmm.
money,
Hmm.
not gouge, get the right quality out. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And I
Yeah.
think it's the same with the workers on the sites too.
Hmm. Well, when you look at the demographics of our industry, right? It's 70, depending on whose stats you want to look at, between 75 and 82% of the Canadian construction are contractors, independent operators like yourself, right?
Yeah.
Kind of,
Yeah.
they call them mom and pop shops,
Mhm.
employees from
Yeah.
1 to 20.
Yeah.
And that's the reality. You'd like to
Yeah.
think, yeah, you have your underground economy, not dismissing
Oh
it. It
yeah.
exists and it creates
Yeah.
problems for guys like yourself and other people who,
Everybody. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So not dismissing it, but overall, you're right. I think it's people just trying to find a way. So you throw in a pandemic in the middle of that. You throw in some of these uncomfortable conversations around racism, and
Yeah.
it was one heck of a year last year in construction.
Yeah.
And so
But you know
looking
what is
ahead, go
sorry,
ahead.
go
Sorry,
on. No, go on,
no,
go
no,
on.
finish off. Go.
No, but what I find interesting is I feel like every year there's always something that
Hmm.
takes hold in our industry, right? There's like
Yeah.
there's and it's I don't mean like kind of neat in a way, but it's kind of nice that it's not like 5 to 10 different major things happening at the same time and we're trying to scramble for everything.
Right.
It almost feels like there's one big thing that happens in a year or 2 years, and then there's more awareness, and then there's more awareness that, hey, there's like 4 or 5 other things that are going on for that specific issue. Let's try and resolve that, and then, you know what I mean? And not necessarily take your eye off it, but always be aware of it, but come up with tangible steps to improve that.
Yeah, and for us as reporters looking into the industry and covering it, when I think about my team, like December was a particularly dark December in Ontario construction. Like in the end, we had a total of 8 construction deaths to finish off the year in this jurisdiction, and that's crazy, right? Crazy. So we took the unprecedented step with us with the Daily Commercial News. We blackened our front page after there was the spat of like 6 deaths in 5 days, just to kind of show that it's like, this isn't just another statistic. Why is this happening? And for me, it brought me back to the swing stage tragedy here in Toronto from just over 10 years ago, when 4 guys were on a swing stage and it broke apart at Kipling Avenue. I remember going out there on that Christmas Eve and going to the scene. You know what I mean? And seeing the swing stage broken apart 13 stories up and seeing bodies tarped over.
Wow.
Right? So here we are all these years later, and on all these separate projects, all these guys getting killed. And it is getting killed. It's not an accident. It's an incident. It's something that happened. Why? Is it the COVID question? Those are the questions. There's your typical question as a journalist you start to ask.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean? There's like, is it a shady shop? Is it legit? Who's the owner? Like, were they rushing because it's Christmas? But more of the questions we started to ask this year was like, is there COVID fatigue on these sites? Yeah. You know what I mean? Are people tired of the parameters and rules? Are they rushing on these sites because of the delays COVID created and the rules around it? So I'm curious to see through our team how we explore that this year and the answers that are going to come out of those investigations into those deaths, because to have so many, such a short period of time in one jurisdiction raises a lot of eyebrows.
Yeah. Right? I mean, going back on COVID too, the same thing holds true. You look at, just our health and safety standards, right? Like they always say 2 people have to be working together. Right? Lifting stuff that's heavy, and I wonder if that causes some issues at times, because, maybe somebody doesn't want to work with somebody else because of COVID. How do you maintain 6 feet trying to, you know what I mean? It's tough. It's tough. Right. So that's why I think you're right. We'll have to see how it goes, how the trend goes. And, and like I said, it's just trying to be prepared a little bit.
Right. So as we wrap up, I'll ask you from a podcasting point of view, as a construction podcaster.
Back to the podcast.
Back to the podcast. I respect because we are cross-podding. But I'm curious, what are you looking forward to? What kind of conversations are you looking forward to trying to explore this year?
It's interesting because there's a lot of different ones, but I think for me, it's like on a couple different trains, and really it's 2. It's the talk about sustainability and how we can, actually, I would say sustainability in general, because, repurposing, you said, somebody was trying to buy a shopping mall and repurpose it, right? That's a form of sustainability people don't talk about, how is modular construction, like City of Toronto just built those homes and stuff, right? Modular, how is that going to take hold? Are we paying attention to the details of modular construction? Because 15, 20 years down the line, if it doesn't serve that purpose, have we kept the proper BIM records and the connections so we can say, you know what, I need, piece A, piece H, piece J, and then put it together and take it to a different job site and do something different, like repurpose portions of it. You know what I mean? But I think it's also just talking to different people within the tech sector. I've been a little averse to jumping on fully with the tech side. I'm just talking about from the business perspective, because there's so many options out there, and you got to spend the time to figure out something that fits, actually. But for me, I'm really interested in talking to more engineers and architects and designers and be more inclusive on their side. I've been talking to a lot of people who've had construction experience and, how, what they're pushing with changing mindsets. But, some of the architects and engineers as well are really coming up with different ideas for, like, for example, like, vibration and sound, right? Installation, different methods for, just how we build things. How do we build things offsite to improve, efficiency
Right.
on site? Like, so things like that. I had an interesting podcast with Professor Carl Haas from University of Waterloo. So I'd like to reach out to more universities, because it's, my conversation with him, I said, when I was in university, I probably didn't care too much about what they were researching. But then, as I was talking to him, and he started sharing me what they were researching, I'm like, this has practical implications for, because now you're in the industry. It's a different mindset, right? So, talking to them, because they're looking at things like 10 years down the line and doing the research now and doing the testing now on something that could potentially take hold, and just because one idea doesn't come on doesn't mean it's not a good idea. So, it's just talking to a lot of different people regarding that. But I did want to talk to more people, part of the education side, be it colleges teaching trades, be it tradespeople, or even like, just construction in general. Because I find a lot of people are still not fully jumping on board to get into construction. It's almost like, they go to school and then they want to become a project manager right away. They want that, and it's just like, there's a process, right? Like, you got to understand drawings. You got to see how these drawings become a 3D on site and how it fits together, So talking about why there's a disconnect between, what's determined blue collar, what's determined white collar in the traditional sense. Because nowadays I think they're one and the same, really. Yeah. Right? There's no distinction, because I'm only as good as the guys on site doing the job, and they're only good as me getting the work as well. Yeah.
No, that's the thing people need to understand. We talk about the stigmas around construction, and I'm glad you want to explore that. It's something we continually do, where we try not to, as media entities, we try not to show bias or express a bias. But there's only two areas where my team and myself, I'll fully admit, we have a bias. One is health and safety. You know what I mean? Because most of us have either been in construction families or currently still have members in construction on my staff. You know what I mean? Like, we want the industry to be safer. So that's why we take it to heart when we see what happened in December. So we want to continue that. And the second thing is apprenticeship and training and the future of the industry. We have a bit of a bias because, you could say it's because you cover the industry. That's why you want to still be able to cover it. You need people. It's true. But in talking to people like you or other companies that are established, like, you see the issues around not having quality skilled trades or not having enough skilled trades, or people wanting to eventually get on that project management track or, supervisor track. Like, there is a labor shortage. You know what I mean? And
there is.
Real.
There is.
And we'd like to see, what are the solutions, and keep people, questioning and looking for solutions. That's the thing too, is everybody relies on sometimes these governments to come up with answers, and then you'll hear the industry going, well, where'd you get that solution from?
That's
right. You actually talk.
Inquisitive.
Yeah,
right?
So
completely. And it goes off, I think one of my first episodes, a gentleman from San Francisco, and he's a civil engineer, and he started teaching high school kids the trades by building tiny homes. Because he said, growing up, he was pushed into, engineer, lawyer, like, the big ticket items kind of thing. And he's like, there is another option, and you can make a good living. People think that if you're on the tools, you don't necessarily make a good living, and they bypass it, but you can. You actually can make, but it goes back to just like any other industry. As long as you're good at what you do and you're passionate, it'll return financially and otherwise. You know what I mean? Like, if you're not good at it, you're not going to do well.
No, and that's right. And you know what I mean? And that's always the question then, will you still be passionate about something you're not good at? And people tell you you're not good at it, right? It's like, it's not for everybody. And it's about how to make it realistic for some of these the new workforce that wants to come in, right? So they can, every job site, whether it's an office, a construction site, doesn't matter. There's politics everywhere. You're always going to have your bad apples. There's always issues, right? But as you know, we're preaching to the converted probably with our listeners, right? Construction's a hard job.
It's a hard job.
You know what I mean? It's a hard industry. It's rewarding. It definitely is, but it's taxing and it can be demanding. And you got to have to be wired a certain way to be involved in it. Right.
And you know what? To jump off the question you asked, I'll just tell you this. You said, can you be passionate about something you're not good at? And I'll talk about just a lot of people in general. I'll give you one example. And I actually give this as an example to people. they golf.
Yeah. That is true.
Right?
That is true.
Like most people who golf are really passionate about it.
But they're awful.
They're awful.
And I learned that pretty quick the first few times. I'm like, I'm not going to get passionate about this because I'm really not good at it.
Right.
All right.
So let me flip that question back to you before we end. What are you looking forward to this year in your conversations?
Definitely. With the podcast, through the podcast lens, played my hand a bit. We are going to explore the issue of racism in construction a bit more deeply nationally, not just here in Ontario. I look forward to those kind of conversations. I think they need to be had, considering the feedback we got from the industry on our general reporting about the topic. One, we would get, an accolade like, hey, thank you for doing that. That's really great. But B, you don't know the whole story. You know what I mean? Or this is the story you need to tell. So we're kind of working on that, framing that out a bit more as a team, carrying those conversations and seeing where the issue is. Obviously, looking to see what happens with the construction economy. I still foresee myself when I looked at the scheduling of the podcast guests. Yeah. I'm going to be doing check-ins with folks that have their finger really on the pulse of what's happening, depending where they are in the construction pipeline, right? Whether it's manufactured, building product manufacturers or sub-trades or GCs, right? Yep. Look forward to those conversations. I think we saw last year, and you and I talked about this when we first introduced ourselves, when we had our first kind of exploratory conversation. I found but because of the pandemic, the idea of reset in construction, the idea of now starting to look at some kind of innovation or improved efficiencies, whether it's on the back end of a construction company, like internally or externally, that started to come to the fore. And we started to hear a lot more from a lot more innovators, people that have brought innovation to the industry, started approaching us and saying, you're asking the question if this is the time for the reset, this is our experience. So I want to share a bit more of those conversations with our listeners because it was popular last year when we did it. And the reason why I measure the popularity is we started to get questions like, hey, can you connect me with that person? Or other innovators would be like, that's a good point, but this is what I learned, because those innovators may be 3 or 4 years ahead on the arc of the pain of trying to bring innovation to construction, right? So,
but isn't that the best? And that the reason why, part of the reason why you do the podcast is to reach people, right? Like, same for me when some people said, "Hey, I never knew that this worked," and I reached out to them. Like, like that kind of feedback is like, you know what? I guess I'm doing something right.
Well, exactly.
Right. So,
and we must be doing something right week to week. We're putting and recording these things. So
exactly.
People are listening, so we keep it up. So.
Perfect.
Well, Rahul, I think that's great. I think you and I think maybe our listeners get the sense. I think we could go on for a little bit.
Continue for a long. I think we can continue for a long time.
I think we could do a 3-part series just on looking ahead at 2021. But
you got it.
I do foresee us checking in with each other this year. I'd be curious to see where we're at come the next quarter or halfway through the year.
Yeah, you never know. It's a whole new world, as they say. Right?
Yeah, for sure. So for sorry to cut you off. I was just saying, so for the sake of my listeners, you'll see it in the show notes when we post. But if you want to tell people listening where they can find Build Our Future.
Yeah. It's pretty much all the platforms, Spotify, Apple, Google, Amazon now has it too. You can go on our website, rahulfaria.com/podcast. Actually, we're working on a dedicated podcast website now, which will be buildourfuture.fm, and that's probably going to launch in the next week and a half. But yeah, so those are the general spaces. I post everywhere. You can find links on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. That's where you and me connected as well. Right. So so I mean, pretty much all the normal spots. You want to find a little bit more about me. The website's there as well. So basically everywhere you can listen, you can listen to it. So
perfect. Yeah. And for the sake of your listeners, if you want to listen to the construction record, if you found this interesting enough and you want to learn a bit more about what we do with our pod, you can find it on any podcatcher that you have, as far as on Google Play, Apple Podcasts, we're there, Spotify, we're there as well. Our podcast page is off our main newspaper website, so that's dcnonl.com/podcasts or joconl.com/podcasts. The DCN stands for Daily Commercial News. JOC stands for Journal of Commerce. Yes, and you can track us on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and on Instagram as well, and Facebook. you'll find posts about us. You'll find this posted there as well. So, in the end, I hope our listeners get something out of this, with two different shared perspectives. And
Totally.
I really enjoyed it.
It's interesting coming from a reporting side and from a contractor side in these conversations, right? So
exactly.
It's been great. Thanks for having me on, Vince, and great you joined as well. Always fun. I mean, we can keep talking as you know, so we got to end it sometime.
Exactly. Sounds good. Well, look, thanks again, Rahul. That was really great. And take care, everyone. Thank you.
This episode of The Construction Record is brought to you by the Ontario Sewer and Water Main Construction Association. Clean water is everybody's business.